Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another monitor review. In this one, my friends, we're going to be taking a look at an affordable 1440p gaming monitor, the KTC Play H27T22S. That's a mouthful. This is a 180 euro/$200 monitor, and it's currently on sale at the time of recording this video for $160 on Amazon. It has an IPS display, 2560 by 1440 resolution at 27 inches, so the PPI is at 107. Everything looks sharp and detailed here, and you get a buttery smooth 180 Hz refresh rate. That's less than $1 per hertz, guys. Pretty nice. And I think with these specs, it makes it a pretty compelling option to someone using something like an RTX 4070, 4070 Ti, RX 6800 XT, or 7800 XT. So in my gaming test a little bit later in this video, I'll be using a 4070 Ti GPU. Anyway, let's test the quality of the actual display. Starting with color accuracy first, I used this tool from Calibrite to check it out, and I recorded 99.7% of sRGB, 75% of Adobe RGB, and 79.2% of DCI-P3. Now, this is a little bit below what they state on Amazon. In one of the images, they say that it has a 122% sRGB color gamut, and well, it's a little bit lower. Even if you count the actual volume, it's at 112, so not quite 122%, but from the spec sheet that they sent to me, it actually says 99%. Anyway, that's not bad or anything. Out of the box, it seemed like it came calibrated actually, which was nice. So it makes it pretty adequate if you want to do a little bit of video or photo editing still. It's not professional level monitor, of course, but it works. Next up is brightness, and I used the same Calibrite tool to measure it, and I recorded a peak brightness of 330 nits. Slightly below the advertised 350 nits once again, but that's plenty enough to enjoy some gaming even in well-lit rooms. In fact, I got my huge spotlight right there, and you can see the monitor absolutely fine. So that's gonna be okay unless your monitor is actually facing a window, for example. That way, with sunlight directly hitting the monitor, it might be harder to see at 330 nits, but that's like a niche scenario. It's probably not gonna happen to you. Now, they state that it's also an HDR monitor, and if you're looking for an HDR experience, this is not gonna do it, okay? It's not a good experience at all. It doesn't have that peak brightness to use HDR properly. But honestly, this is just my opinion now. I don't really care about HDR. I have HDR on my actual monitor that I play with every day, and I don't even turn it on, so you're not missing out on much either, unless you buy like a $1,000 monitor or something like that. Contrast is next, and this is the only metric that I don't really have exact values for, unfortunately, because my tool supposedly reads contrast, but it doesn't, so there's that. But they advertise a 1000:1 contrast ratio, and I totally believe that. Like, it looks as good as my main monitor that I have in front of me at the moment. It's fine in that regard. It's just normal IPS stuff, and most people will be happy with it, in my opinion. Now it's time for the response times. To test this, I used this LDAT sensor sent by NVIDIA, and this time I took response time numbers from 180 Hz, 120 Hz, and 60 Hz. With and without many overdrive settings, and this has a ton of overdrive settings, by the way. Starting with the overdrive settings set to standard, which is how it comes out of the box, at 180 Hz, you need response times to be specifically under 5.5 milliseconds. Otherwise, you'll see some smearing and ghosting or motion blur. Thankfully, this monitor got an average response time of 3.6 milliseconds and a maximum of 4.5 milliseconds. This stays well under the 5.5 milliseconds threshold, you know, and this means that at that refresh rate, it doesn't have any ghosting or smearing at all. Moving on to 120 Hz, here we need a response time of 8.33 milliseconds to avoid that ghosting and motion blur, and at this refresh rate, the KTC got the same average response times of 3.6 milliseconds as before, with a lower maximum at 4.2 milliseconds. pretty great. But there was a little bit of an issue that we started noticing, guys. And that was overshoot, which is basically inverse ghosting. To avoid any ghosting and smearing and blur effects, it is starting to feed those pixels with a little bit more energy, which makes it overshoot just slightly. Like the numbers here were only at 5%, so it's not really noticeable while gaming, but it's there and it's starting to slowly creep into our image. Finally, at 60 Hz, we got yet again the same averages and maximum response time numbers, but now with a more noticeable 8.3% overshoot, which starts to get a little bit noticeable, not gonna lie, when you're playing games at 60-ish FPS, but it's not the end of the world either. At least it's not black smearing or ghosting that you get in like VA panels of this price range as well. But the most concerning value here is that maximum overshoot of 36%. That's quite a bit. It's going to be noticeable in those gray to gray scenarios. Again, it's a little bit too much, but I got good news at least. The other overdrive settings will actually fix this. The advanced overdrive setting is next, and at 180 Hz we got even lower response times of 3.3 milliseconds on average and just 3.9 milliseconds maximum. That's absolutely insane. But this was at the cost of 3.3% average overshoot, which we didn't have previously in the standard mode. So I guess you can see where this is going. To the sunset. I mean, at 120 Hz we got roughly the same response times again, but with 8.7% overshoot, and at 60 Hz the overshoot got bumped even further to 12.1%. Yeah, I wouldn't use this mode compared to the standard mode. The standard was not perfect, but it's definitely better than the advanced. Just for fun, I set it to the ultra fast overdrive mode next, and at 180 Hz we got a super low response time of 2 milliseconds, okay, on average, and 3.4 maximum. Those are really low response times, especially for the price point, but again, this was at a huge cost of overshoot. This time we got 41% overshoot on average. Yeah, I guess this mode is just there for bragging rights if you want to say that your IPS monitor has super low response times, but nobody should play like that. The inverse ghosting is insane here, okay? And if you're interested, these were the results at 120 Hz and 60 Hz respectively in this mode. Next I tried the auto overdrive setting, and here are the results. Didn't get any overshoot, which is impressive at the 3 refresh rates, but at the cost of some ghosting. So now we're on the other side of the spectrum. This is because the maximum response times were above 5.5 milliseconds, so you can start seeing some ghosting that way. Finally, I tried the overdrive setting off. These are the results right here. It got extremely similar results to the auto setting, so I think I would either choose this or auto or standard. If you are prone to noticing the overshoot, choose these. If you are prone to noticing the motion blur, choose the standard setting. I would go for standard because it's really hard to spot the overdrive there. And if you're wondering, yes, you can play competitive games just fine with it. There is no motion blur at those higher refresh rates. That's a really, really nice result. Oh, and I almost forgot, but this also supports FreeSync and it's G-Sync compatible as well. Let's go dark now and check out the Backlight Bleed. As you can see, there is a little bit of backlight bleed in this unit towards the bottom left and top right corners, but you actually gotta look for it though and have a completely black screen to notice it. While playing games, it isn't noticeable at all, and it's actually better than average for an IPS panel, I would say. And that's it for the panel itself, guys. Overall, I think it's definitely a good IPS for the money. Maybe it could be a little bit brighter for a better HDR experience, but that's about it. I don't really care about HDR anyways, and if your monitor is not in front of a window facing the sun, it's no problem whatsoever. I think the brightness on it is more than adequate. Let's move on to the build quality now, and this is where they started to cut some corners to achieve the lower price point. The monitor itself is made of plastic, which is expected. There are no creaks or anything, so it feels sturdy. The base, however, is made of metal. That was a nice surprise. I was expecting a plastic base, but since it's made of metal, they were able to make it a little bit smaller than what you usually see in monitors at this price range, and I like to see it. Unfortunately though, there is no height adjustment, which is a bit of a shame. I would like to have seen that, but again, for the price, can't complain, I know. And there is also no swivel. To swivel it, you actually got to move the base alongside it, as you can see, or pivot. Not a big deal, again, but I would like to have seen at least height adjustment here. You can tilt it, however, as you can see. At least there's a little bit of an adjustment that you can do. Now, onto the back of the monitor, we can find the little joystick, which you can use to navigate the menus. It works really well, and that on-screen display is feature-packed. It has everything that you could hope for. You can adjust the usual color, brightness, contrast, overdrive, sharpness, adaptive sync, language settings, and so on. I feel like nothing is missing here. Even the sharpness slider is there, like I complained about in the previous monitor that I tested in this channel. Still on the back of the monitor, we find a VESA mount. It actually comes with some screws in the box if you want to mount it that way. And below it, we find the ports. Going over the ports from left to right, it has the DC power jack, a USB 2.0 interface, a couple of HDMI 2.0 connections, which can provide 2560 by 1440 at 144 Hz, and then you got a couple of DisplayPort 1.4 connections, which can provide the full resolution at 180 Hz. Finally, all the way on the right, there is the headphone jack, which sounds okay. You know, I wouldn't really use the headphone jacks in monitors. Usually your PC has better headphone jacks. And lastly, let's play some games on this monitor right here, and I'll talk to you about my gaming experience in 5 different titles. Let's go. First we have Counter-Strike 2, and this one with over 200 FPS all of the time was a buttery smooth experience. Obviously I couldn't really spot any ghosting or overshoot. We are well above 180 frames per second, so there's none of that here. And honestly, I didn't really feel like I was losing anything, honestly, compared to a 240 Hz or a 360 Hz monitor. So unless you are super competitive, I think 180 Hz is totally fine, even for a game like Counter-Strike 2, and you can definitely be competitive at it. Next is Red Dead Redemption 2. This game is a beauty to behold. Things are colorful, there's a lot of detail in this game as well, and you can make out a lot more detail at 1440p 27 inches than, for example, a 24-inch 1080p display. So it's definitely quite good, even for single-player titles like this one that are a little bit too blurry for my taste because of that TAA. Still, it's enough to kill Bob, so I'm happy with that. Next is Cyberpunk 2077, and in this one there's a bit more contrast to the image, you know, although I was playing the DLC in this particular video. This time I was using DLSS quality plus frame generation and ray reconstruction to see how is the quality here in a 1440p display at 27 inches, and it was pretty good. Of course, it's a little bit softer than without any frame generation. That's normal, but it's still a very nice image here to look at. No motion blur, no ghosting, no nothing at those 100 to 120 FPS most of the time. And once again, it's enough to kill Bob. But seriously, even if you want to use ray tracing and all of the bells and whistles, and I was using that here, of course, you can actually have a really nice image out of a display like this one. And I can't believe that a monitor like this is actually so low priced these days. Next is Spider-Man Remastered, and it's another single-player title. I am focusing more on single players here, but well, that's just personal preference of mine these days. Spider-Man is a little bit more fast-paced, you know, swinging around the city, but you can still make out all of that detail at 1440p resolution. I was using the native 1440 res with DLAA plus frame generation, so frame generation was still there, making things slightly softer than native, but here in this case I couldn't really notice much of a difference. Everything was super sharp and detailed and beautiful. Those reflections, even though they are not ray traced, they still looked great, and overall it displayed a really nice image here in Spider-Man Remastered. And finally, Forza Horizon 5 is the 5th game. This one is absolutely gorgeous to look at as well at extreme settings, 1440p native with 4 times MSAA, so no blurriness at all here. This is true native resolution. I really loved the experience here in Forza Horizon 5. The RTX 4070 Ti also provided really high FPS in this one, most of the time actually below the 180 Hz refresh rate, which is nice, you know. Actually, in most of these single-player titles, you should probably lock your FPS to 180 frames per second or 179, so you stay within the G-Sync range. This way, you won't really get any screen tearing at all. So that's been it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this review. I can definitely recommend this monitor. It's probably the best one that I could find so far for under $200. That's 1440p high refresh rate as well. It's great that it's not a VA panel. IPS is much superior in terms of those colors and ghosting and stuff like that. Response times were great here. I mean, you've seen the video, so I'm just gonna get out of here. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Love you all. Bye-bye.